I didn't fall because my balance failed or because the driveway had a crack I missed. I fell because a hand at my wrist yanked with certainty and a plastic bin caught my knees with a thud that traveled up into my stomach and made my teeth click together. There was no shout, no slam, just the quiet scrape of rubber wheels on hot concrete, the soft slap of the lid, and the smell of lemon cleaner lifting out of the trash like it had an opinion. I stood before my brain caught up because standing is a habit I learned early, and when I turned, my father was already walking back toward the garage as if he had just returned a rake to the right hook and the yard could stop worrying about itself. My name is Hallie Price. I am 26 years old, and this took place in June and July in a neighborhood off Barrett Parkway in Cobb County, 10 miles northwest of downtown Atlanta and exactly 4 miles from the pediatric clinic where I work the early shift. We live in a split level that was beige when we moved in and is still beige because our HOA has feelings about paint. The loop is half a mile if you count the cut-through where Mr. Butler sets up his yard sale tables every second Saturday, and you can tell what time of year it is by the noises floating between houses, leaf blowers in November, pressure washers in April. Baseball announcing in June weather or not anyone is actually watching. My sister, Morgan, is 22 and has a way of moving through space like there is a camera capturing angles you and I can't see. My mother volunteers at church and keeps a food pantry spreadsheet that could run a small army. My father runs a landscape crew that turns into a snowplow crew when Georgia remembers winter for a week, and on Sunday mornings, he is the kind man who ushers with a program in his hand and a handshake that makes people feel like they were seen. On the first Thursday of June, right before the heat settled into something serious, I swung my little Corolla into the left side of the driveway because I'd stopped for eggs and paper towels and 2 bags cut into my fingers. And I left my keys on the hall table because I thought I would be back in a breath. I wasn't back in a breath because my father met me at the door frame like a person who has been listening for the exact sound of a mistake and said, "You're blocking your sister's car," as if those 4 words were a code he'd needed to deploy. 10 seconds, I said, tipping my head toward the keys that sat not 3 feet away. He didn't wait. He took my wrist with a pressure I recognized from somewhere older in my body, pulled me backward so cleanly the door hit my hip, and the rolling bin we keep by the garage took my knees like a linebacker that didn't believe in sidelines. I caught myself with both palms because that is what you do when the ground comes up faster than your knees planned, and the sting landed all the way to my elbows in a bright line. "Across the street, Mr. Butler watered his zinnias and nodded to the radio on his porch as the Braves announcer murmured about a double to left that sounded like a favor to a man who needed to hear a statistic. My father nudged the bin back upright with a quick kick that looked practiced and said, evenly, "Don't block your sister," and walked past me toward the garage like the sentence had solved something a wrench couldn't. I moved my car because there is a way the morning gets ruined if you make it compete with your heartbeat. The steering wheel felt slick under my palms, and I could see the faint grid from the bin lid printed across the skin between my thumb and first finger. Morgan came out of the house with a tote bag and a laugh already on her lips. She was talking to someone on speaker and didn't look down. "Hallie," she said in that half-sweet way of a girl who never checks the mirror twice, "you know how to park, right?" And she smiled at the person on the other end as if we were giving them a small scene to spice up their drive. I eased the car forward until there was more concrete than anybody could argue with, and when I went back inside, I washed my hands until the sting agreed to sit in the back of the room. We ate tuna salad for lunch because no one wanted the oven on. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and dill, and my father turned the TV up 1 click so the local news filled the kitchen with chatter about a water main break 2 miles over and a feature on a Little League team that had played 10 innings like they were being paid by the hour. No one mentioned the bin or the pole or my palms. My mother asked if the clinic's vaccine shipment had landed on time, which is her way of finding safety in other people's logistics, and I said it had. After we ate, my father set his plate in the sink, wiped a ring of moisture off the counter that didn't need wiping, and said, "Let's keep the driveway clear," like he was talking about leaves. I said, "If you need me to move a car, use your voice and wait 10 seconds, and he looked at me the way he looks at broken sprinkler heads that decide to be complicated in July. "You make things big," he said, and walked out to the garage. The second Sunday of June, the sermon was about self-control, and the pastor told a story about a person who counts to 10 before they answer their spouse, and everyone laughed because they recognized themselves. The soprano 3 rose up, tried for a high note, and missed by a hair, and the choir director smiled without calling anyone out. After service, I poured coffee for older ladies who pretend to want decaf, and then add a full sugar packet. I stood between the fellowship hall and the hallway to the classrooms and answered questions about little ones' camp forms because the clinic knows my face in town. We drove home in the kind of quiet that's not unfriendly, just full of things none of us wanted to risk spilling, and over pot roast my father said the bin shouldn't be so close to the door. Somebody's going to bump it. Like the week had been a study in furniture placement. My mother cleared plates with the efficiency of a woman who has run a kitchen line without getting paid for it, and when my phone buzzed later with a wellness check knock on our door, I felt my heart step off a small curb even before I opened it. 2 officers stood there under the porch light that makes bugs count themselves, and the taller one used my name gently and said a family member had called because of concerning behavior in the household following an argument about property. Morgan was in the den pretending to scroll. My father was suddenly very interested in his phone. My mother stood with a dish towel in her hands and didn't move. "I'm all right," I told them, and I said it like a nurse saying breathe before a blood draw. "I'm angry and I'm clear and I'm making a plan that uses paper, not volume." The younger officer nodded with the practiced relief of a person who prefers doors to remain on hinges and wrote something in a small notebook. He handed me a card with a hotline and said, "Use it if nighttime gets louder than it should," and the phrase landed in my pocket like a smooth rock. The door closed and I heard the Braves highlights leak through the wall from next door, and I realized I was shaking in the dumb way you shake when the thing you knew about your family decides to stop pretending. Fixing it with talk felt like the right first move, because that's what the shows tell you, and because I like the person I am when I try quietly before I do anything that echoes. On the second Tuesday of June, I put 3 mugs on the kitchen table at 6 a.m., the hour when the house is most honest, and I said I needed us to agree on a rule that lived on top of the driveway. No curling into the L. If someone is boxed in, you use your voice, you wait 10 seconds, and you don't put your hands on people like they're objects in the way of objects, I said. And I heard my own voice trying to be both calm and specific in the way I am at the clinic when a parent is worried and a child is in no mood for needles. My father didn't look up. He scrolled through messages from 3 men who own mowers with names like boats and shook his head. "I'm not writing house rules for one adult who likes to feel managed," he said. Morgan, who was braiding her hair and watching herself in the microwave door, said, "You're a lot lately. Maybe sleep more," and smiled at herself like she had landed on a kindness. My mother put a hand on the coffee pot like it might steady something and whispered, "Let's keep the temperature down," because that phrase has always been the fire extinguisher of our kitchen. I stood, rinsed my mug, and put it on the rack, and for the first time in a long time I understood that the only rule I could write in this house was about what my own hands would not do. In the space between that decision and the next morning, small consequences arrived like birds. My car insurance app pinged during my lunch break with policy change effective June 15th, and the app that usually lives in the quiet part of my phone lit up like a supervisor who wanted a word. I opened it, expecting a rate adjustment, and found I'd been removed from the family plan and pushed into a backwater line item that doubled my share. The notice had a timestamp that matched my father's usual before-sun coffee. I printed the screen at the clinic copier because paper behaves, and I took a photo in case the printer made choices. On a hunch, I logged into the BMV portal and checked my title status, which I'd last looked at when I was 20 and more trusting. It still had 2 names on it, mine and his, because at 18 he'd insisted on safety. And then we forgot to undo the safety when the safety turned into a rope. My stomach went loose in the way it does when you step into air thinking there's a stair. I called my Aunt Tony, who lives 2 miles away near the skate park and keeps her pantry stocked like a woman who has decided no one she loves will run out of anything important on her watch. "Bring your facts and wear shoes you can think in," she said, and I drove over after my shift with my palms still showing a faint checkerboard in the right light. Her kitchen smelled like the same lemon cleaner as my mother's and a stronger cinnamon because she believes recipes should remind you they're in the room. I told it once, all of it, and she listened without looking at her phone. And when I finished, she opened the drawer with batteries and rubber bands and put a legal pad on the counter like she had been waiting for a reason to use it that didn't involve appliance serial numbers. "No porch fights," she said. "Paper and dates. You're going to urgent care if that knee still feels wrong and ask for a note. You're going to ask Mrs. Butler for her ring video of Thursday because she told me at the bake sale they finally installed it after last Halloween's pumpkin situation. You're going to flag your title and your mail so no one reroutes your life by keyboard. You'll be polite. You'll be specific. You'll breathe." She slid me a sheet protector like we were packing our own exhibit. "And then you'll sleep on my pullout while you let the house cool from being the stage it wants to be." I meant to take the narrow fix and be done. The narrow fix had other plans. On the second Friday of June, a white pickup eased to a stop in front of our mailbox with the kind of confidence only trucks and teenage boys have, and a guy with a towing chain looped over his shoulder hopped out like he was collecting a favor. "Your dad says this one's getting moved," he said, nodding at my Corolla even though it was 2 feet from the curb like the HOA emails tell us, "You're blocking," and the words sounded rehearsed. I was halfway down the front walk when Mrs. Butler, famous for plant starts and committee notes that never misspell a name, stepped off her porch with her phone at a 45-degree, like she was checking the weather, and said, "Jason, if you touch that car, I'll be delighted to call code enforcement, and we can all take a quick dive into right-of-way," and she did it in the tone women from church save for second graders and powerful men. Jason made a show of listening to a call he had not received and left. 10 minutes later, my father sent me a text that said, "You're making this complicated," as if complication were not the only weather this month knew. Dinner that night was grilled chicken and store coleslaw and a TV tuned low to the Braves like soundproofing, and over a forkful he told me the decision had been made. Morgan would be taking the garage studio by July so she can focus, and I could move back into my childhood room until you're ready to be part of a team. My mother kept her eyes on her plate and her hand on her napkin like she didn't trust it not to do something else. I put my fork down, one of the little tin where we keep extra keys, and slid the studio key onto the counter. "I won't be dragged across a driveway by a person who can't wait 10 seconds, I said without raising my voice, and my heart didn't sprint. "I'll be at Aunt Tony's. We'll handle the rest on paper." He laughed without humor and said, "You always run to the women. They can't fix this," and Aunt Tony texted at that exact moment, "Pullout is made. Bring your toothbrush," which is the kind of timing that makes a person believe in cause and effect again. By the last Monday of June, the folder had a spine. I had an urgent care note that used words like contusion and abrasion without dramatics. I had Mrs. Butler's ring video on a flash drive and her email giving permission to share, with any relevant authority, I had a receipt from the post office red card that says no one touches your mail unless you're looking at them from across a counter. I had a screenshot of my title status and a handwritten number of a clerk at the county tag office who likes doing things right, and I had my name written in big letters on Aunt Tony's guest towel, so I wouldn't feel like a visitor inside the life I was temporarily borrowing. If you're waiting for a loud turning point, it didn't arrive with a bang. It arrived in the quiet of a municipal office that smells like coffee and carpet cleaner, with a woman behind glass who uncapped her pen and said, "Let's put a note on your file that says counter pickup only, and then sign here where the date actually matters." I went home to Aunt Tony's, sat on her couch under the old clicking fan, and wrote a list I titled Plan That Fits in a Month. Under it I wrote, "No new fights on porches. Ask the HOA to write down what polite looks like. Ask for a classroom, not a kitchen, if the pastor offers a room with neutral chairs. Use the card if nighttime gets louder than it should. Don't apologize for paper." I slept with the folder on the chair by the window because I wanted to know where my spine was if I woke at 3 and couldn't remember who I was supposed to be brave for next. The escalation didn't slow because I put a nicer word on it. If anything, it took my list as a dare. On the last Thursday of June, code enforcement left a bright orange flyer on our door about unpermitted rental activity, which is a fancy way of saying someone had told them I was running a boarding house out of a studio attached to a house I don't own. The note had been filed anonymous, which in our town often means family. The officer who answered my call said he'd been in our neighborhood anyway because someone 3 streets over decided to strip a couch on their lawn. He met me at the curb, glanced up at the window to the studio that has always smelled like wood and fan dust in July, and marked unfounded in a neat box. "I'll note neighbor dispute," he said gently, and there is something about a man with a pen narrating your life that makes your shoulders drop even when the rest of you is still holding. I took the orange sheet, slid it into the protector behind Mrs. Butler's video release, and stood on Aunt Tony's porch as the Braves highlight from the night before floated from her neighbor's TV at just the right volume to attach itself to my exhale. I thought that was the bottom of the hill. At 9:30 that night, when the heat finally let go and the ceiling fan learned to make its quiet tick every third turn and not every other one, my phone buzzed with a pastor's assistant asking if Thursday at 7 worked for a family conversation in classroom B. And with that sentence, my month clicked into Act 3 whether anyone acknowledged the label or not. On Thursday, I packed the folder the way Aunt Tony taught me, front pocket for ID and insurance, middle for prints and notes, back for anything that might make a person stop pretending. And we walked into classroom B at church 10 minutes early because arriving late makes people think you're asking the room to do work for you. The building smelled like old coffee and lemon cleaner in a way that made me both calm and alert. The fluorescent lights hummed just enough to be noticed when no one was talking. The pastor had set out 4 chairs in a squared oval and a pitcher of water on the center table with paper cups. He wore the expression I remember from funerals when people want him to explain what cannot be explained, and he chooses instead to narrate what can be. He said he had asked for a neutral room because kitchens and living rooms come with memories you didn't invite. Aunt Tony sat in a 5th chair behind my left shoulder with a legal pad she didn't intend to use unless someone forgot who was in the room. My father walked in with his hat in his hand and his jaw set to a temperature he thought no one else could feel. My mother came in behind him and placed her palm on the back of his chair without sitting, like the chair might roll away if it didn't feel her there. Morgan arrived last with sunglasses propped on her head like she might need them in a building with no windows. The pastor opened with the same short prayer he uses when he doesn't intend to let it become a speech, and then looked at me, not because I needed to go first, but because he wanted the person with the folder to set the tone. I said I wanted 3 things on paper, and then we could decide whether we could share potato salad on Sunday. No touching and no blocking cars or people. No service accounts or applications in my name or at my address without written consent. No wellness checks called unless someone was actually in danger. My father laughed once without teeth and said we were dramatizing recycling bins. The pastor glanced at the folder like it had asked him to call on it. "Let's talk about dramatizing," he said, and his voice did that thing it does when he wants a room to pick the right lane. We have a neighbor's doorbell video. We have an urgent care note that uses nouns instead of adjectives. We have a flyer from code enforcement that knows the difference between public and private. We will keep our words tight because the paper has already done the heavy lifting. My father said the thing he planned in the car. "She blocked her sister's car," he said with a calm so even it could have been mistaken for kindness. "I moved her out of the way. She fell into the bin. It looked worse than it was." The pastor slid a still frame across the table, the kind where the black and white turns hands into shapes you can't misname. My wrist in his fingers, the bin lid mid-tilt, my knees not yet caught. "Does this look worse than it was?" he asked, and the room went hot in that way fluorescent light can make heat show its face. My mother made a sound I know from childhood when I fell off a bike and insisted I hadn't. Morgan stared at the table like the wood grain pattern had hidden letters in it if she just kept looking. My father looked at the ceiling first and then at the frame, and the set of his shoulders changed by a degree that for the first time this month did not make me feel like I needed to hold mine up alone. He didn't apologize. He didn't have to. The paper had stripped the sentences of their camouflage. The pastor had one more page, and he handled it like a person carrying a glass of water on a crowded stair. He said he had submitted a lawful records request for the audio from the wellness check because he prefers facts in his meetings and not impressions. He pressed play on his phone speaker, and we heard a man who sounds exactly like my father tell a dispatcher calmly that his older daughter was unwell after a conflict over property, that she had a habit of exaggerating, and that we'd like a welfare check to have it on record. There was a timestamp, a street, a please and thank you, and the click. It was the first time this month anyone in a room with me had tried to pretend the weather didn't just shift. My father rubbed the bridge of his nose like he was trying to decide whether to be the man from the tape or the man in the chair. "I wanted a paper trail," he said. "You like those?" Here we are, and the way he said it would have stung if I hadn't already decided to let disgust slide off me like dishwater down a stainless sink. "I like paper that tells the truth," I said. "We can agree on that." We signed. That is the cleanest way to put it. The pastor had typed short statements based on my list and his own ethic, an acknowledgement of the civil no contact, a promise not to call in officers as a parenting tool, a prohibition on accounts and applications in my name, and a commitment to use the HA's driveway courtesy rule instead of improvising with obstacles. He wrote the date in a hand that belongs on postcards. We each used a pen that didn't smear on the paper even when hands were damp. My mother signed as witness and Aunt Tony signed as second witness, and when the last loop on the last letter finished, the air cooled between my shoulder blades like a vent had opened somewhere we couldn't see. Morgan pressed her lips together in a line you might call contrition if you hadn't watched her perform it for better audiences. "I'll take down the post," she said, and for a second I thought she meant the doorbell still. But of course she meant the story she'd put up about me on a morning I wasn't watching. "I don't want your apology," I said, not unkindly. "I want your silence if you don't have facts." She flinched a tiny bit because facts make bad decorations for people who live online. We didn't leave the room suddenly kinder. We left it carrying a shared object we could set on the table when mouths started wanting to be clever. Out in the church lot, my father stopped by the azalea bed he'd helped plant 2 years ago and said without looking at me, "I don't like being the man from the tape," and I said, "Then don't be him." And we both stood there longer than needed because sometimes standing is the point. By the time I reached Aunt Tony's, the Braves were already in the third. the ceiling fan had found its quiet rhythm, and my phone had a text from Mara that said, "I saw you walk in. If you want coffee after work tomorrow, I'm done running from your month." And that line put water back in a part of me I hadn't noticed was dry. Loss keeps its own calendar even when the meeting gives you a receipt. Friday at the clinic, a parent who knows my family through PDA asked the front desk if her child could be assigned to a different nurse, just for now, because we have so much going on. And the request made my fingers go cold for a minute until my boss handed me a lab slip and a smile and said, "People Project, we draw blood." That afternoon, my insurance card arrived with my own name alone and a rate that made me tilt my head for a second to be sure it wasn't a misprint. I smiled in spite of the math because it felt like a small, official thing that had chosen to believe me. Saturday morning, the HA newsletter went out with the driveway courtesy rule tucked between a reminder about pool noodles and a note about lawn heights and misses. Butler had underlined the phrases "text first" and "pull all the way up" in exactly the way I would have if I'd been asked to lay a highlighter on a paragraph without moving the furniture. The discovery came the following Tuesday, and it didn't arrive with a siren. It arrived with a smiling clerk at the county tag office who called to confirm that a duplicate title request had been submitted online using my VIN and my plate. "We flagged it because of the counter pickup note you put on last week," she said, and I could hear in her voice the satisfaction of a person whose system had done exactly what it was designed to do. "Do you want to authorize anyone else to collect?" she asked, and I heard my own voice say no, with a steadiness I hadn't felt since day one. She told me she'd deny and notate, and that if anyone wanted to challenge it, they could do so in person with ID and signatures. But the computer would keep asking for the page that only I could sign. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand long enough to hear the Braves ad on the AM station in the next room remind people about fireworks for the 4th. And for the first time, I felt a shape settle in my ribs that didn't require me to hold it with both hands. The ally I didn't expect turned out to be the mail carrier. On Wednesday, he walked up with a stack of coupons and a smile that didn't root around in my life for sport, and he told Antoni and me that our red card had kicked back too busy forwarding attempts, his word. And I liked it because it didn't make a story bigger than it needed to be, and that the note on our address had turned into a small icon in his handheld that told his replacement on days off not to accept any changes for household without a face and an ID. "Saves a lot of nonsense later," he said, and I thought of the week when our neighbor's mail disappeared into a cousin's summer fling because someone thought a nice script and a printed form could rearrange a life. With those little pieces set where they belonged, I did the thing that still felt like the right language for my family. I invited my parents to Antoni's for Sunday lunch because people behave better around food they didn't cook. And I wanted them to see me not as a problem, but as a person who could have potato salad and not make a witness list in my head between bites. My mother arrived with lemon bars wrapped in foil and the recipe card tucked under the pan like a small white flag. My father brought his hat because he doesn't know what to do with his hands when he doesn't have tools. And he brought 2 folding chairs because he has never met a porch that didn't need furniture. We ate chicken pulled from the oven right when the skin crackles and greens that tasted like somebody had salted them with memory, and the Braves game hummed through Antoni's living room the way I like it. Low enough to remind everyone there's a world out there that doesn't care who set a recycling bin where. No one said the word bin. No one said blocking. At the sink, my father rinsed a plate and said to his reflection in the window, "I signed. I'll stay signed." And I said to his back, "Thank you," and we didn't make it more than that because more tends to break when you hold it too hard. Of course, the month wasn't done with me. On the second Tuesday of July, trash day, I swung by my parents to pick up a box fan from the studio because Antoni's guest room runs hot and my budget had a plan that didn't include new fans. And I came up on a scene that made my shoulders go up before my brain gave them permission. Our rolling bin half up the driveway, angled like a barricade. And my father pretending to check the lid as if he'd forgotten the new HOA rule he'd signed next to a line about no stage managing people with objects. I parked at the curb with the tires kissing space the way a parking manual would draw it. I stepped out with my phone in my pocket, but not in my hand. I texted, "Did you get it?" And he said without turning, "Bin stays. Morgan's got errands. Don't block." I walked to the porch and stood in the shade I had earned 2 Thursdays ago. "You're violating what you signed," I said, like a person reading directions. I didn't raise my voice. My body remembered the notice on the file and the way pens behave when they write dates and the way a doorbell camera turns angles into words. I called the non-emergency number because that is the channel we had all agreed the river would flow in now. "Civil no-contact violation," I said into the phone. "No weapons. No yelling. An object is being used to control a person's access." I'm waiting on the porch. Officer Riley is fast in our neighborhood when the call is boring on the scale of things that happen to people in other neighborhoods. He walked up the driveway with a face that said he would prefer to be checking firework permits and left his pen in his shirt pocket until he was sure it needed to come out. "Morning," he said to both of us and waited a long enough beat that someone who likes to win with a story would have spoken to fill it. No one did. He pointed with his chin at the bin. "That where it usually lives?" he asked, and my father said, "It lives where I need it, because he cannot help turning even objects into soldiers." Riley tipped his head toward the curb where the grass meets the slice that belongs to all of us whether we like it or not. "Public apron is part of access," he said. "You sign no contact on people and things used as extensions of people. You can see how this looks," and he wasn't asking. My father rolled the bin back like it was a personal defeat and set his hand flat on the lid for 1 second, like he needed to tell it he'd be back, and Riley wrote something on the pad that lives in all their pockets, "Warning to file," he said without pressure. And he asked me to pull my car forward 2 feet so the trash truck wouldn't shave my bumper if someone got fancy. I did it because there's a way to let a morning end on a decent note even when it started trying to be clever. "We good?" Riley asked, and no one needed to answer. He nodded and walked back down the drive like a person who has seen a family learn one basic thing and calls that a win because the rest isn't his work. The last piece of Act 3 landed at 3:41 that afternoon when my phone lit with a call from the BMV clerk whose name I'd written on a sticky note on the front of my folder. "Just calling to let you know your title's been cleaned up," she said, and my throat did that small tight thing it does when a sentence ends a month you didn't schedule. "Sole owner, Hallie Price. Mailing, your aunts for now. Duplicate, counter only." She sounded pleased in the way people do when their job lets them hand back to someone a thing they thought they might lose. I thanked her without making a speech. I hung up and drove to Aunt Tony's parking lot and sat there with the air running for a minute longer than made sense. When I went in, she had a pitcher of tea already sweating onto the counter and a small plate with 2 lemon bars because she believes good news settles better with sugar. "Sole owner," I said, and she laughed the way women laugh when someone in their family has just solved a problem with steadiness instead of a storm. "Good," she said. "Now let the ink dry before you go poking any more bins." I would love to tell you that was the moment the month decided to stop being itself. But the truth is more ordinary. The Braves went to extra innings. Our HOA sent out a poll reminder about not running on wet concrete. My mother texted to ask if I needed napkins at Aunt Tony's because the place sounds echoey. And Morgan posted photos from a yard sale where she sold dresses she'd bought imagining a different story and kept the ones that let her breathe. My father sent one text, "Oil change at 3,000. Don't skip," because he doesn't know how to be anything else yet, and I answered, "I won't," because I don't either. The bin sat at the curb on trash day where bins belong. The porch learned the quieter noise of a family that had decided to let a folder be a referee. My hands stopped remembering the lid pattern. My knee didn't throb when I went up Aunt Tony's steps at night. Act 4 was going to ask for more than a signature. I could feel it in the way the air held itself the first Sunday of July when the hymn We All Know by Number landed solid, and the pastor shook my father's hand at the door like they were both grateful for the existence of indoor voices. But for that weekend there was peach pie and an evening game humming low through a neighbor's open window, and I lay on Aunt Tony's pullout under the fan that clicks once every 3 turns and wrote one short line in my notes app to make sure I didn't lose the thread. When the next thing comes, do what you did, paper first, breath second, quiet third. The last Friday before payday, the air felt like a damp towel and the Braves were away, which in our neighborhood means lawnmowers run later and the AM station sounds a little lonelier. I left the clinic with my scrubs sticking to my back and drove the 4 miles to my parents' to pick up 2 boxes I'd labeled Winter in sharp black letters so big no one could pretend not to see them. I had texted the group chat the night before, swinging by at 5 for boxes from studio, 5-minute grab, per signed agreement, and no one had answered, which I took as the closest thing to consent my month was interested in giving. I turned onto our loop and even before I reached our mailbox I saw the new change. A cheap silver padlock on the studio door and a sheet protector taped above the knob. The paper inside read Abandoned Storage, Access by Appointment, Property of Household. And the words made my pulse move up into my throat in a way I recognized now as my body asking me to pick a lane. I parked at the curb 2 feet from the mailbox like the newsletter asks. I walked to the porch with nothing in my hands but breath and the folder. I knocked on the front door to keep the record clean. My father opened it halfway with the chain still on and said, somehow both casual and hard, "We're controlling traffic," as if my boxes were a highway and I was a truck he could ticket. I didn't raise my voice. Per the signed agreement, "I'm retrieving my boxes," I said. He looked past me at the studio door like he wanted to admire his own work and told me I'd need to make an appointment with him at a time that isn't dinner, and my body went cold in that useful way. Like when a nurse knows the vein at the crook of your elbow is stubborn and moves 1 inch without you noticing. I nodded once, stepped back to the edge of the porch, and called the non-emergency number from the spot where the shade kept the sun from getting ideas. "I'm requesting a civil standby to retrieve boxes from a locked studio," I said to the dispatcher. "No yelling. No weapons. We have a signed agreement. There's a new lock." Officer Riley wasn't the one who arrived. It was a woman I hadn't met yet whose name tag said Sims and whose face said Friday wasn't her favorite day to explain property lines to families. She walked the distance from the street to our porch like she had counted it before, leaned into the studio door to read the sheet protector without touching it, and asked me to show her my ID and the page with the signatures and dates. I handed her the folder open to Classroom V. She read faster than most men I've worked with. "Okay," she said, not to me, to the air, the way a person says it to make a decision sit up, and then she knocked on the front door and set her tone to the place the pastor had found 2 Thursdays ago. "Sir," she said when my father opened it just as far as the chain would allow, "you signed that you'd handle access with paper, not devices. This qualifies as a device." He bristled as if he'd been downgraded to a noun he didn't like, then peered at her name tag like it might tell him a different story, and then finally unhooked the chain and stepped back. I heard my mother in the kitchen moving a dish from one counter to another as if the location of objects had become the way to breathe. Morgan stayed out of sight. 5 minutes, my father said, but no one took his word as law anymore. Officer Sims did what men in our town don't like being on the receiving end of. She ran the show without asking for permission twice. Inside the studio, the air was hotter by 4 degrees and smelled like warm wood and old fan dust. My 2 boxes sat where I left them, under the table with the blue paint drips that you can never sand out because they have decided they belong. I slid them into the hall one at a time, each tape seam intact because I used too much tape for this exact reason. "List what you take," Officer Sims said softly, and I nodded and wrote winter coats, sweaters, X2 on a page she initialed with her last name. My father stood in the garage doorway with his hand on the frame, like he was a man in a photograph of his own life, and said nothing. I did not look at him because my neck belongs to me. "Anything else?" Sims asked, and I shook my head and handed her the pen back because it felt good to let someone else keep the control object for 1 minute. Outside, she folded the warning slip into her pad in that tidy police way and said to my father, "Locks our devices," and to me, "Text the office if you need another standby. You are not deprivation bargaining under a new padlock." And that line was so crisp I tucked it into my pocket where I keep the card with the hotline I haven't had to call. At Aunt Tony's that evening, we ate takeout I paid for in cash because my new insurance premium has me watching my card like it could grow teeth if I let it. And the AM station replayed last night's game, and I listened to an announcer talk about a kid getting called up from the minors like it proved something about patience. "He put a lock on it," I said, once my ribs were behaving. "Of course he did," Aunt Tony said, and she slid a typed letter across the table with the church letterhead at the top even though it hadn't been written by the pastor. It was written by his assistant, who is a woman who understands forms and also the inside of our family. "Notice of noncompliance," it read in the blandest possible language, and the blandness sent a small ripple through me that felt like relief. "Found this in my inbox when I got home from the pantry," she said. Sometimes the system helps itself along. We moved in silence for a while because the best parts of family are sometimes the quiet parts that need no commentary, and then she pulled an apartment listing from the online marketplace up on her tablet and said, 7 miles from the clinic, 1 bedroom, 2nd floor balcony, $1,175 plus utilities. Says cats are negotiable if you put down a larger deposit, and I laughed because the precision of those numbers calmed a part of me that had been running laps in the dark. "You can afford it if you keep your grocery bill where you had it the month you decided to like eggs," she said, and I could. So I made a showing appointment for Saturday afternoon and put bring recent pay stub, ID, and copy of title fix on a sticky note, because this story has taught me that paper answers questions my mouth is too tired to keep answering. The showing lasted exactly 18 minutes because the landlord had 3 other people before me and 1 after, and he liked questions that sounded like I'd looked up the bus line even though I would not be riding it. The carpet wasn't new and wasn't trying to lie about it. The balcony was small, but just big enough for a chair and a stubborn plant. The deadbolt was new and had that satisfying click seatbelts make when they want you to believe in them. The kitchen still had someone else's idea of countertops, but the stove was clean and the water pressure didn't try to pretend it was a parade. I signed a lease because sometimes the only way to end a month is to pick a date it will not be allowed to go past. Move-in Sunday, 2 weeks out. Security deposit in dollars I could trace all the way back to shifts I took when other nurses wanted a day at the lake. Aunt Tony hugged me with both arms and then handed me her calculator to make sure I didn't need to pretend the numbers made sense. They did, if I respected them. The all is lost moment still came, because a story like this seems to prefer drama as a final exam. The Tuesday before my move date, the clinic's HR printed a note and asked me to step into the small office in the back with the poster about harassment laws on the wall. Someone had called the front desk to file a concern about a staff member's instability, using phrases that sounded too familiar to be a stranger. "We have to do the dance," my manager said, not unkindly, and she asked if I felt safe at work and at home, and whether I needed accommodation of any sort. I had my folder because I've started carrying a slim version in my bag. I slid across the urgent care note, the civil acknowledgement, the HOA courtesy rule, and a screenshot of the concern. Log the front desk takes when they can tell a call is more about the caller than the target. My manager read quickly, the way people who run busy places learn to, and wrote no action, employee steady, family background noise on a form. "We trust you," she said, and her voice had enough respect in it that I felt the knot between my shoulder blades let go an inch. "If it shifts, we shift. For now, go draw blood. The 7-year-old in room 4 wants your sticker basket." I left the office, washed my hands like any other hour, and did my job without shaking, and that felt like a victory no one can film. Moving day was the last Saturday of July, and the subdivision sounded like soft hammers and radio commercials. Aunt Tony drove a borrowed van. Mara showed up with 2 rolls of tape and her apology already used up and put in the drawer where we keep past mistakes. Mrs. Butler brought 2 rolled towels and a bag of snacks because she seems to always know what tomorrow's version of you is going to wish you had today. My mother arrived with lemon bars under foil and napkins with a summer pattern and the kind of face that tells you she has decided not to fix anything and intends to stand in it with you anyway. My father drove up late and stood in the doorway with 2 folding chairs and his hat in his hands. He set the chairs on the small balcony and looked at the cheap railing like he couldn't decide whether to trust it or fix it. "Fan'll help," he said to the air, and I pointed to the corner where Aunt Tony's old stand fan already sat clicking once every 3 turns. He nodded and looked at my mother, and then at me and said, quietly, without trying to make it more than it was, I signed. "I'm staying signed," and I said, "Thank you," because that's all that the sentence can hold in a room where too much will make the drywall crack. The Braves were at home that night, but my TV wasn't set up yet, so I put the game on the radio and let the announcer do a small lullaby while I unpacked 1 box labeled Kitchen Basics and 1 labeled Sheets/Towels. And I ate a lemon bar over the sink because my plates were still in the living room and because eating over a sink is the kind of ceremony that tells you you're allowed to make small choices without asking a committee. I texted Aunt Tony a picture of the deadbolt and the small rug and the stubborn plant, and she sent back a thumbs up and "Plant will live if you don't pretend it needs love every hour," which is how she tells me to get out of my own way. Before I went to sleep, my phone buzzed with a text from the group chat that didn't ask anything of me or try to sound like a court. It was my mother asking if I needed napkins because the place sounds echoey. And when I told her I had 3 rolls, because Aunt Tony knows me, she sent a heart, and I let the fan do its click, and I fell asleep without seeing a bin for the first time in 2 months. You asked for revenge at the beginning, some clean curtain drop that looks like a victory people could clap for even if they don't know what it cost. This is the version I have to offer. I didn't light a match, I wrote dates. I didn't raise my voice, I carried a folder. I didn't ruin anyone's job. I put rules on the table where porches couldn't pretend. A padlock came off. A title lost a name. A driveway learned to mind its own business. A wellness check turned into a note on a file that says we won't be doing that as theater anymore. My father texts about oil changes like a man teaching a daughter who is 12, and I answer like a woman who is 26. Morgan sold 2 dresses she bought for the wrong life at a yard sale and kept the jeans she can breathe in. My mother brings napkins and a jar of her spice mix and stands in my small kitchen without trying to move a single thing I put down. Sunday mornings, I still pour coffee for older ladies who pretend they want decaf and then take 2 sugars. The pastor shakes my father's hand on the way out, and neither of them tries to make that moment do more than a handshake can do. On the 2nd weekend of August, I sat on my balcony with a folding chair and a glass of iced tea and listened to the sound of someone else's TV hum through the warm air. Not loud enough to make me feel like I had to count my breath. Just enough to make me remember this is a street where people still wave without walking closer if you don't want them to. The ending is clean, not neat, and I can live with that. When trash day rolls around on my block now, I roll my bin to the curb the night before like a person who believes in what happens when everyone follows a small rule and gives the big ones room to stand. Sometimes I pass Mrs. Butler on the half-mile loop and she taps her phone in her pocket like a secret. Sometimes the mail carrier waves and says, "Red card still working," and I tell him thanks like he delivered me something more than coupons. I have a deadbolt that clicks like it means it, a fan that announces itself just enough to remind me not to hurry, and a folder on my shelf that weighs more than paper ought to and exactly as much as this month required. If I hear a recycling lid now, I don't flinch. I think about taking it out early because the truck comes fast on my street, and I like a day that starts by keeping a promise.